Welcome everyone to the Social Emotional Learning Training for secondary students. I'm excited to see several faces who participated last week and then some new people with us. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Emily Pratt and I'm from the Education Alliance. The Education Alliance is a nonprofit organization that mobilizes business and community support for public schools. There have been substantial increases in stress and anxiety for students and adults due to the recent pandemic. In order to support student mental health, the Education Alliance received a grant from the Palatine Foundation of Huntington that enabled us to work with Dr. Christine Schimel and Amanda Ingram from West Virginia University, along with a steering committee of experts listed on page 1 to develop an easy-to-use toolkit to support student mental health. The Social Emotional Learning Toolkit provides age-appropriate strategies for supporting social and emotional learning. Each grade level section includes research to consider as well as activities to implement with students. The toolkit is designed for anyone who works with students, including after-school providers, faith-based organizations, coaches, local nonprofit agencies, and more. Today's training is designed to help you learn how to integrate these mental health best practices and strategies into your ongoing student support for secondary students. For participating in today's training, you should have received a printed copy of the toolkit in the mail. You can also download a PDF version of the toolkit on our website at educationalliance.org/SEL. The Social Emotional Learning Toolkit in today's training was made possible with generous support from the Palatine Foundation of Huntington. I'll now turn it over to Chris and Amanda to share how you can integrate these mental health strategies into your ongoing student support.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Chris Schimel. I'm an associate professor in the counseling program at West Virginia University. Thank you all for joining us today. I see familiar faces from our training a week ago on the first section of the toolkit. We're glad that you're back with us if you're joining us for the second time. We're really excited if you're joining us for the first time. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about who I am and my experience, and then I'm going to let Amanda, one of our fantastic graduate students getting ready to graduate, I'm going to let her introduce herself. But I am Chris Schimel. I'm 20 years in professional counseling, 21st year as a counselor educator. I'm a licensed professional counselor here in West Virginia. And I'm a former school counselor. I've been an elementary, a middle school, and a high school counselor. So that's a little bit about my background. I also worked for a year, I would say the hardest year of my life, with adjudicated youth that were court ordered to be in a wraparound program. I worked for the West Virginia Youth Advocate Program as an in-home therapist. And that was really tough work because we were working with middle school and high school kids, some of the kids we're going to be talking about here today, who lacked a lot of resources, had experienced a lot of trauma, were in all different phases of sort of family dysregulation, I would call it, a lot of upheaval. And they basically ended up with us because a judge said, we're going to try this before we take you away from home and send you to some kind of residential or foster care placement. So I've worked with some really tough kids who are experiencing really tough circumstances. I was excited when Emily reached out to me about this particular project because I do a lot of training for school counselors and clinical mental health therapists and social workers, but there are so many more people on the front lines of working with youth in the state of West Virginia and beyond, and that's you all. So many different ways and capacities in which you work with youth, and I think right now, especially on the heels of the COVID pandemic and also on the heels of the social justice and racial pandemic that we've been awakened to here in our country, our students, our young folks are struggling with stress, anxiety, and depression. And when Emily reached out to me on this particular project, Amanda and I were excited to be able to pull together some tools that might help you in your work with the kiddos you work with. So we're excited to be here with you today. Amanda, tell them a little bit about yourself.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I am currently a WVU graduate student for a few more days until I graduate on Sunday. Super excited about that. And as Dr. Schimel mentioned, when Emily asked us to work on this toolkit, I was super excited because I knew that not only it was fun to create it, but I would also be using these tools. And I am currently in my internship in an elementary school. And After I graduate, I will be headed to Virginia to work in 2 elementary schools there. So I'm super excited to continue using all of these tools with my current students.
And the really neat thing about Amanda joining us today is that I'm going to go over, and we're going to start on page 25 of the toolkit if you have your copy in front of you, and you can kind of follow along. We are not going to read to you, but we're going to just share some sort of best practices or thoughts that we have on each of the activities for grades 6 through 8 and grades 9 through 12. And the great thing about having Amanda here is that she is using some of these. So she's got great stories, and she's actually going to take the lead on talking to you about some of the activities. We want to make this open. Please ask questions as we go. If you have a question or you have a thought about a particular strategy, we'd love to hear from you. Before we go any further, though, we took some time last week and folks were unmuted themselves and told us a little bit about the work they're doing. We have a lot of people who are returning, so I don't want to maybe do that today, but if you would go into the chat room here and just post, what is your work with young folk? Like what is your role? What got you interested in coming to this training, to having access to the toolkit? What's the capacity in which you're using these activities or working with kids? If you could just sort of park that over in the chat, that would let people see, get a little feel for the audience and give Amanda and I a feel for who you are and the really important work that you're doing. So Emily, if you want to share a copy of the toolkit, we're going to start on page 25. When I train school counselors, when they first come into WVU, into our program, I typically, when I ask the question, so what grade level are you thinking you want to be a school counselor in? Elementary, middle school, high school? I typically get one of two responses. Dr. Schimel, I am all about the elementary kids. I want to be an elementary school counselor. Or I get, Dr. Schimel, I'm going to be a high school counselor. I love high school kids. That's where my passion is. Very seldom do I get anybody saying they want to be a middle school counselor. And when I say, well, what about middle school? They'll say, oh, no, Dr. Schimel, I don't want to be a middle school counselor. It's an interesting conversation because what I say is, I think if I were to change career paths tomorrow and go back to being a school counselor, I think I'd want to be in a middle school. And here's why. In middle school, when you're talking about 6, 7, and 8, some of our middle schools in West Virginia are 5, 6, 7, and 8. You get the best of both worlds. You get those little developmentally sort of immature kids who are still functioning like elementary age students, right? And you still are being like creative and fun and doing artsy things and drawing, and they're really into it, and they still think you're cool even though you're older, right? They see you as very old, but you're still kind of cool. And then you've got these older kids who are a little more cognitively advanced and willing to process things at a little deeper level. So personally, I love this grade, but they come with their own little set of challenges, right? Any of you working with grades 6 through 8 kids, we're basically talking somewhere between 11 years old, and it could be all the way up to an early 14-year-old. They come with their own set of challenges for sure. So if we look on page 26, I just want to point out a few things for those of you who are really focusing your work on this age group. It is super important to understand the cognitive, literally the changes that are going on in their brains. This is a time when there is a lot of stuff happening in the brain. There are a lot of neuro pathways that are being made. We're going to watch a video here in a little bit that's part of the toolkit, but I love this video, so we're going to watch it together. There are lots of neurons being pruned, right? And the brain is kind of cutting away some stuff. There's a lot of growth that's happening. Their prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that we use to think about, consequences and make sound decisions, it's really kind of forming and still developing. And so I often say they've got a real mushy front brain here, like, because it's not fully formed. So they have a lot of problems making good, decisions, right? They're very impulsive because that part of the brain that helps us make good decisions isn't formed. The one thing I want to point out here, like with number 1, is understand that when you're in that grade 6 to 8 developmental frame, there's no like map for where they should be in terms of cognitive development. They're really going to be all over the place, right? You could have a sixth grader that cognitively is relatively advanced and is able to have a vocabulary and a cognitive structure and a vocabulary that looks and sounds like a seventh or an eighth grader. But you might also have an eighth grader who's very developmentally sort of not there. And they could often sound like an older sixth grader or a seventh grader, right? So in this range, within that range, you can have this even wider range of how they think and how they function. Some of you that are educators or you've tapped your toes into education theory, you've studied Piaget, they are really transitioning from concrete operations to formal operations. So I guess what I want to say is you might try one of these activities on Monday with a sixth grader and it goes great. And then you might try that same activity on Tuesday with a fifth grader or a seventh grader and it flops. And then you might try it on the third day with a fifth grader and it goes great. So Amanda, I can see you, like, would you agree with that? Like this is that developmental period where it can be hit or miss. So you got to understand where they are cognitively.
Yes, for sure. I was actually dealing with a situation earlier with a lot of fifth graders, and I could definitely, they're getting ready to go into middle school, and you can definitely see how they're all at different points.
Yeah. So you think, oh, well, they'll all be about the same because they're the same. No. You can more so bank on like kindergartners and first graders more being sort of cognitively on the same level. When you hit this middle school age, sometimes these activities can be hit and miss, and you have to just try things, be very forgiving of yourself. And if it doesn't work, you try it again tomorrow. So I want to say that. Here's the other thing I think it's super important for us to remember about this age group. Their peers are the bomb. Their peers know everything. Their peers are the experts on everything. Adults, we know nothing. Just get used to it. We're kind of ignorant. We're old and we don't know. So look, it's just a natural progression of how they're developing. Again, it goes back to developmental theory. Peers are more important than adults. Peer relationships are much more important than adult relationships. That doesn't mean they can't thrive and they don't need adult relationships. But just don't get frustrated when you share something really fantastic with a kiddo in this age and in this age range or this developmental range, and they don't think it's cool, but then their friend comes along and says the exact same thing, and that's the bomb. Like, oh, well, that's the gospel because my friend said it. We got to not get our feelings hurt by that, and we have to just recognize where we are with that. Here's the other thing I want to say. This is why if you're in a space working with kids in this age range, working in small groups can be really great. You can really use that to your advantage because like Amanda's going to talk about circles of control. Well, I can sit one-on-one with a seventh grader and talk about circles of control and it not seem very relevant, or they see how maybe it can help their friends, but it maybe doesn't, it's not going to apply to them. But we get 4 or 5 seventh graders together and one of them says, well, this is cool. I can see how you can use it. Well, I can see how you can use it. Oh my gosh, look at how we can use it. And miraculously, we just all thought of this on our own at 14 years old, right? So groups can be really powerful in this developmental stage. So if you have that opportunity in the spaces where you're working, to work in groups of 4 or 5 or 6 kids at a time, because they're going to listen more to their peers and take advice better from their peers, maybe than they're going to take it from you. And lastly, let me comment on this. And I had a session earlier today with a 14-year-old ninth grader who was a little bit cognitively, not delayed, but just cognitively probably thinking more like a 7th grader or an 8th grader. And they're developmentally designed to test you. And they're going to say things maybe to try to shock you. Don't be shocked and don't be alarmed. A lot of times in this age group, because peer relationships are so much more important, we have to work a little harder if we're an adult trying to step into that space. So a lot of times it's a test, right? I'm going to say this outlandish thing to see if you're really as credible as you want me to think you are, if you're really going to hang in there with me and not judge me. And the kiddo that I was working with today, I could tell that there was a little bit of a test coming at me from the minute they walked in the space because of the way they were dressed, right? I almost sensed that there was a presentation of dress to see if I would go like, wow, you're really dark and scary. But I didn't, right? I didn't react in that way. And I thought we had a really good first session. Whereas if I would have been like, whoa, tell me what this look is about with the razor blade hanging on the cross around your neck, like, tell me what that's about. I think the session would have gone very differently. So don't be surprised when this age group, this developmental group, they want to see if they can say something, do something, draw something, or even wear something that maybe shocks you as an adult just a little bit. Okay, so I hope that that's sort of just some helpful overview. We're going to move on, Emily, to page 27. And Amanda, I think you're going to talk about circles of control. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, so I'm really glad that you used that example about using this with groups of kids, because they do have those aha moments when they tend to be with their peers and they see either something that their friend says or maybe writes. So for example, I had 2 fifth graders that I actually used this with, and they were boys, and we actually went through this and we were talking, and I was like, I think it would help if we write this down. And they kind of were going back and forth about like, oh, well, I can't control that. I can't control this. And they were like, it was just interesting to see how the peers had a conversation versus how our individual sessions were going prior to that. So it was really neat to see how they interacted and kind of talked about what they can and can't control.
Did you think they were kind of challenging each other in a way that where they accepted the challenge, like, well, yeah, you can control that, dude, you can control, like, whereas if, and they were like, oh yeah, maybe I can, versus where you were saying, well, you can control this, right? It just, the message comes differently when it comes from those peers.
Yes, it was almost like a totally different conversation that we were having, which was like crazy to watch.
Yeah. Yeah. And this honestly was a lot about my session today. Maybe I should have pulled out the toolkit and used it with my 9th grader, because we were talking a little bit today about things that they can control versus things that they couldn't control. And I just think having this conversation in a very intentional way with this age group, Amanda, I think that can be really helpful, because they don't have that concrete thought process about, well, I can control how I act in a classroom. Right. I can't control how the teacher reacts to me, but I can control my behavior, right?
Right. Yes. Another thing that I had them do is actually read them out loud, because it's one thing to write something down, but to have a student read what they wrote, I feel like that also helps like stick, you know, and they'll remember that. So I like to go through and have them read what they can control and what they can't control.
So were you using this actual graphic in your group with them?
Yes, I believe so. Yes.
So then again, let me pick up on something Amanda is saying, especially for this age group. Well, we sort of believe in our program that with any age group, including adults, it's better if you cater to a lot of different learning styles. So that includes doing a lot of writing and drawing and a lot of physical activity with kiddos that you're working with. But the value in actually having them write on something that looks like this, a graphic that looks like this, and then having them take it with them or store it with you in the place where you work with them so they can come back and revisit it, it can be very helpful.
Yes. Yes. I try to give them something to take away with them. So that also reminds them they can go back and look at it. So I always try to give something from sessions that I have with students.
And I will say too, just for future reference, that the graphics and the activities that you see us, that Amanda and Amanda was great about helping me really locate activities that we thought worked well with the kids that she's working with and the kids that I've worked with. These activities, you should be able to find these graphic images on Google or on a website. So it should be things that you can download for free and use, that you don't have to draw or recreate. So if you just go on Google and put in circles of control, you're going to find probably 2 or 3 images similar to this that would allow you to download, print off, and use with the kids you work with.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of different images like that. So they have different ones. Some have more circles on them. So yeah, it's really helpful to have that for them to be able to write if they want to.
Okay, Emily, we're going on to page 29, and Amanda's going to talk about My Tranquil Turtle. And then be ready after we discuss this activity, folks, we will open it up and take some questions or thoughts about the first two activities. So Amanda, tell us about My Tranquil Turtle.
So this one, I really like this because it's another one, you know, where they can write out different coping strategies and they can kind of change it to, you know, different coping strategies that work for them, not just like, okay, I'm going to name some and you're going to write these down and they're going to work for you, because we know everyone's different. So before this activity, I usually go over a lot of different coping strategies that they might be able to use. And I tell them, you know, which ones stood out to you or which ones do you think you could use? And like I said, I have them write them down and then read them aloud to me. And with this, there's, for this specific activity, there's 6 different ones. And I tell them, I want them to pick out their 2 favorites. And those are the 2 that I want them to focus on until we check back in again, because 6, I feel like, is a lot for someone to work on. Even for myself, if I had 6 different coping strategies I was going to practice, I feel like that would be overwhelming. So I try to have them pick 2, their 2 favorites that they want to work on and that they will remember. So, and again, I like to give them the activity so they can take it with them and remember.
And Emily, if you'll scroll up just a little bit at the top of the page, you'll see an example there of things that you might help these kiddos include on their Tranquil Turtle. And really what this activity is about is a lot of you've heard about, maybe some of you are actively practicing, but it's about mindfulness. We hear a lot from educators and parents that kids cannot self-regulate, that they cannot control impulsive behavior. That's still true in this middle school age group. Remember that prefrontal cortex that helps kids make good decisions is still really mushy. We even call it that this idea that their kids are really functioning from their lizard brain, right? They're more reactionary, they're more fight or flight, and their wizard part of their brain is not fully developed, the part that thinks. So doing an activity like My Tranquil Turtle and developing these coping strategies helps them increase mindfulness and self-regulation and making that concrete connection to these are the things that I can do to help calm myself, to take a deep breath, to dysregulate instead of actively regulate. So that's what we're really going for here, is helping kids get more in tune with being mindful and being able to self-regulate.
Yes, so that example is really helpful if you need different ideas for what to put on there. But also if you're like, I don't know, I can't think of any coping strategies I'm going to use to help this kid, you can Google coping strategies and there's hundreds of lists. So that's another good thing about this. Pretty easy to come up with. Yeah.
Thanks, Amanda. That's good advice. I mentioned this in our first workshop that we did last week. Let me say this again, and I think Amanda's hitting on something that's important here. If you do not have good coping strategies for when you're feeling stressed out, under pressure, feeling a lot of anxiety, it will be difficult for you to help kiddos come up with good coping strategies. So the analogy that you've often heard maybe counselors use is you need to put your oxygen mask on before you, like on an airplane, right? They often tell you, put your oxygen mask on first before you go to assist a child or someone who's traveling with you. So the same goes for here. If you don't have a good toolbox of your own for coping strategies, then it would be difficult for you to help a child come up with coping strategies. So I think Amanda's advice is good. Check out a list of coping strategies, or maybe you have never thought that hour that you take in the evening to read a book of your choice is like a coping strategy to help you reduce stress and anxiety, but it really is considered a coping strategy. So visiting those lists online and coming up with ideas, or even printing them off, giving them to the kids you're working with and say, well, let's look down this list and see what you would like to adopt as your coping strategy. Exercise, deep breathing, reading. So it's just a good way to come up with different ideas and find the strengths that kids already enjoy doing or can easily use. Okay, Emily, let's maybe stop sharing for a second. Any thoughts or questions on sort of the overview to this age group and the first two activities that we've discussed? Any questions or thoughts anybody want to share? Are we making sense? These making sense? Okay. Is it helpful just to hear Amanda and I go back and forth a little bit about some of these activities? Is that helpful, Vicki?
They're clear, self-explanatory.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
All right, Emily, I guess we'll keep rolling. Let's go back to page 31. I'm going to talk to you for just a couple seconds about plan of action. Many kids in this age range who are dealing with stress and anxiety, they don't have a clear, concrete plan for how to get themselves out of that. Because they don't have that, right? They're very impulsive, right? So what we can do as adults is be very intentional about saying, we need to come up with a plan for you so that when you're feeling too stressed out, too overwhelmed, that you have a way, you have at least 5 ways that or things that you can do that are going to help you feel calm and that are going to help you feel more regulated or more okay. Let's take my client that I worked with this afternoon. She has developed a very, my opinion, a pretty unhealthy coping skill for when she feels extremely stressed out and extremely anxious. And a lot of you are familiar with this, and we're seeing it a lot in this age group, is the way that she has dealt with that, like the one coping skill is to cut and to self-injure. That's an unhealthy coping skill, but nobody's ever sat with her and developed a real plan of action. What do I do when I feel this stressed out and this anxious? She even described it, and I pulled out a balloon. She described it as it's growing, it grows and it grows and it grows. And the only coping skill that she's developed to deal with that is to cut. And to her, when she cuts, it feels like the balloon pressure releases. So this is an activity that a lot of kids really can benefit from, because you want to teach them very intentional ways, things that they can do that when they feel stress building up, when they feel anxious, they can actually implement these things to reduce the pressure. So you can take a graphic off the internet similar to this, or you can, what I even love is having them draw their own hand, trace their own hand on a piece of paper, and say, here are some things that people typically do as part of their plan. They find ways to be positive, to be realistic, to actively do something, to call someone, and to get help. And so what you do is you can write those out on a piece of paper, but then you work with the kiddo to say, what is one thing that you can be more positive about, right? Be positive is not the plan, it's the step, right? So what are the things, what are things you can tell yourself to be more positive? For example, with my kiddo today, this won't last forever. This pandemic is not going to last forever, and you are going to be back in school in some more traditional way where you see your friends, right? So we talked about being more positive, being realistic. Part of the conversation that we had in our long session today was that mom and dad kind of react in a way that she doesn't like to her attire, to the way she dresses, to the way she's colored her hair. And I said, we were talking about this idea. I think you need to be realistic that this is a big change for them. So they're not going to just accept it immediately. It's going to take some time for them to ease into the fact that you want to color your hair and that you want to wear these dark clothes. So we kind of moved through these independently, right? But so being realistic is part of the plan. What does it mean for this particular kid or the kids in this group to have a more realistic view of things? Call someone. Who are you going to call? Let's actually put that on this piece of paper. Let's write that on that finger. When you're feeling overly stressed and overly anxious, who is that person you can call and talk to? So it's actually getting down to very specific plans for how they can deal with their emotional distress. Amanda, any thoughts on that one?
I just wanted to add, I think that this is really helpful too, not only for the example that you gave, but it's almost summertime and a lot of the kids are going home for the summer. So I think this is something that's really useful and helpful for them, just to have, so that they can kind of make it through the summer. If they, I know a lot of the kids I work with, their parents work all summer, so they're kind of in charge of themselves. So I just think this is a really helpful activity for kids.
That's a great point, Amanda. You know, the other thing that just occurred to me too is because so many of you are working with kids through community organizations, and you may have the opportunity to continue working with them all summer, but some kids may be going to a different parent's home for a few weeks in the summer where they don't have good support and good resources. What an incredible gift to have if they take this drawing with them, so that if they're at that other parent's place for 2 weeks or all summer, and they begin to struggle, they've got a plan. They can pull out their piece of paper. This is who I'm calling. This is how I've got to be realistic about, right? It's very concrete. Okay, Emily, we're moving along. All right, we're going to shift to grades 9 through 12. Now, again, on that lower end, that 9th grade level, you can have a wide range of cognitive development going on. And we are going to watch a video that that's actually part of the activity that we include, but I think it's just even good for us to watch it because it helps us really understand where they are developmentally. Let's go down to page 34. And again, I'm not going to read to you, but if you have your book in front of you, this is where we're focused. I would say the key thing I want to say about working with this age group is just keep in mind that they're not yet adults, but they're not kids either, right? They're not, I mean, they have the ability to think, they have the ability to express feelings. Try to avoid forcing them into activities or strategies that they are really not that into. For example, if they're really into video games, try to tap into their world through that, but don't force them to be into video games if that's not what they're into. You might have a really great writing or drawing activity, but this age group will very quickly tell you, I'm not into writing and drawing. I don't want to do that. So you have to try to honor that, right? You can try to sell it and say, let me show you this. Let me show you something. I think it'll be really cool. Well, I'm not really into that. I got it, but let me show you. Let me show you this. Ask, investigate, and honor their strengths. Here's one thing I did with my client that I saw today. I asked when we were having this discussion about self-harm, and she said she hadn't cut now for 6 weeks. I said, tell me about that. How have you done that? Right? What have you been doing instead of cutting? Because whatever you're doing, you've really managed it better the last 6 weeks in a really healthy way. So I want to try to tap into her strengths, right? Instead of just having this whole session focused on why do you cut? Why do you cut? We focused a lot on what are you doing when you're not cutting? How have you coped with that so far? Let's see if we can build on that and see if you can continue to cope in a more healthy way off of the things you're already doing.
I'm just going to add something to that really quick. One of my favorite things that I've learned in my program is giving choices and how important that is and how much kids love, no matter what. I mean, I feel like no matter what your age, you love to have choices. So I've definitely, when going through these too, but just every day, kids love to have choices. So I love to give them the opportunity to choose what they want to do.
So Emily, if you'll stop sharing, I think I'm going to skip these first two, and we're going to go to, if you have your book in front of you, we're going to go to page 41, which is the Teenage Brain Explained. And I want to show you that video for 2 reasons. One, because like I said, it's a very entertaining way to help us as adults, as well as teenagers, understand what's going on in their brain. And 2, I want to make sure that when you're using this video, you're using the correct one. So it's a free video. It's accessible on YouTube. I just want to make sure that you're using the correct one. So Emily, I'm going to share my screen. Is that okay? Okay. Can folks see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I see Amanda saying yes. Okay. So And again, you'll see I just went on YouTube and searched the Teenage Brain Explained, and it's going to pull up the right video there. So we'll watch this together.
Is hard, and so is living with one, I'm told. No human gets to escape this moody, angsty, confusing phase, and interestingly, such an extended adolescence is unique to humans. Other animals grow up a lot faster than we do. And you may think our teen years are just about streamlining bodies for baby making, but as it turns out, the storms of sex hormones that we associate with the teenage years are only a small part of what's really going on in the teenage body. Most of the action, it turns out, is happening in the brain. Until fairly recently, we thought that the brain finished the nuts and bolts of its development by the time we started kindergarten. But really, right as puberty rolls in, it undergoes massive remodeling. This amounts to several years of neural growing pains, as well as the other more visible growth that's going on all over your body. So take heart, whether you're going through it now, or about to go through it, or count yourself among the veterans of that turbulent decade. Know that the result of the teen years is a stronger, faster, more sophisticated brain. There's someone had told me that 20 years ago. Let's start with that obvious scapegoat of adolescent anguish, hormones. That word itself is kind of a lazy shorthand that people use to describe the chemicals that some of our glands excrete that can affect our behavior. But the fact is, hormones have all kinds of jobs that have nothing to do with where you grow hair, or what turns you on, or whether you feel glum for no apparent reason. Hormones keep your heart beating and your body hydrated, and they make your organs grow and make you grow bone and muscle and skin. What people actually mean when they talk about teenage hormones are sex hormones. And yes, puberty involves a whole series of sex hormone storms, the first of which actually kicks in before you're out of primary school. That's when the adrenal glands start secreting androgens, which trigger the growth and activity of the skin's sebaceous glands, making skin more oily. Soon enough, more apocrine or sweat glands get activated, increasing body odor. Then comes the wave of hormonal agents that start activating the gonads. For boys, this influx of luteinizing hormones from the pituitary gland get testosterone brewing in the testes, and suddenly that guy has up to 50 times more testosterone than he did before puberty. This also changes the shape of the male body, promoting hair growth and building up lean muscle mass, just as the increased presence of estrogen in girls rearranges the deposition of their fat, stimulating the growth of breasts. Humans are actually lucky to experience the craziness of puberty only once. Many other animals undergo multiple similarly intense hormonal rodeos as they enter sexually active periods, sometimes called the rut or heat, every new breeding season. Some male species completely stop eating during their breeding period because they're just that sex crazed. And yet, all that said, teens are far less ruled than their hormones than you might think. There are other factors at play here. For example, your favorite moody teen may be by turns punchy, angry, depressed, or in a zombie-like fog because of their chronic lack of sleep. Sleep is vital to everyone, but it's especially important for kids and teens because it's during sleep that your pituitary gland releases an essential growth hormone necessary for development. A normal sleep cycle driven by circadian rhythm is regulated by the daytime release of cortisol, which helps you wake up, and melatonin, which helps you wind down when it gets dark. But this biology of sleep timing changes as we age, and as puberty begins, teens' sleep clocks get pushed back. Most adults start oozing melatonin around 10 p.m.-ish, but one study showed that teenagers don't start producing melatonin until closer to 1 a.m. This may be because puberty's hormonal frenzy is stalling the release of melatonin, and could partly explain why so many teens stay up late, energized by the night, but have a really hard time rolling out of bed with the alarm. Of course, it's a bit of a chicken and egg deal, since watching reruns of The Simpsons and playing Call of Duty late into the night continues to stimulate the brain, which may further delay the release of melatonin. Still, some researchers are starting to advocate for pushing back high school start times in the morning in the hopes of having more focused students. So we got sex hormones changing the bodies and a lack of sleep to contend with, but increasing evidence suggests that there is something much bigger at work that's making teenagers so teenagery. Their brains. It turns out that brains actually take longer than we thought to fully mature. I don't mean physical size. Our brains are already about 95% full size by the time we're just 6, but more in the sense of the connections inside the brain. Adults, for the most part, know how to make decisions by evaluating choices and weighing consequences. They do this with their prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for controlling impulses and emotions and forming judgments. Its neurons chat with the neurons in other regions of the brain responsible for, say, memory or movement through synapses. Thing is, teenage brains don't quite work like this yet. The prefrontal cortex may not be fully developed until your mid-20s, and teen synapses, those lines of communication, are still growing and specializing. They're also slow. As an adolescent brain keeps developing, its axons, the long tail-like parts of the neurons that transmit signals to other neurons, become more and more insulated by a fatty layer called the myelin sheath. This padding greatly increases the cell's transmission speed, and while it helps adults make faster decisions, it isn't fully formed in teens. These changes occur slowly, beginning at the back of the brain where the oldest and most fundamental brain parts reside, and slowly working its way forward to the more advanced and complicated brain bits. The prefrontal cortex is the last to be hooked up and shaped. So it's important to keep in mind that just because your favorite teenagers stayed up until sunrise binge watching The Walking Dead the night before an exam, it doesn't mean they're dumb or lazy. Their brains are just literally finishing being built. But at the same time, because all this brain building is just starting to peak, this is also when the brain starts getting thinned out. You actually start losing connections that you don't use enough in a process called synaptic pruning, which has led to a theory that this is kind of a use it or lose it phase. Meaning, adolescence could be an especially important time to use your brain. Play an instrument, engage in sports, write poetry, learn a language. Because by doing these things, you're helping hardwire those synapses and giving your brain topiary a lovely, lasting shape. Whereas if you're sitting around all day playing Candy Crush, those will be the connections that survive, which you don't need. This shaping of the teen brain manifests itself in other ways too, like in teenage attitudes. A group of scientists at the McLean Hospital in Massachusetts once hooked up a group of adults and a group of teens to MRI devices and then asked them to identify a series of expressions on photographs of adult faces. Interestingly, while adults correctly identified one expression as fear, the teenagers thought the faces showed anger, surprise, or shock. They weren't registering subtlety as well. Not only that, but the MRI images showed that adults and teens responded with different parts of their brains. Adults used the reasonable prefrontal cortex, while the teens mostly used the gut reaction emotional amygdala, located farther back in the brain. Results like these might help explain why teenagers seem to experience frequent mood swings. For one, they tend to react quickly from the emotional part of their brain without running those reactions by the more rational frontal cortex, and two, it could be that they're just misreading expressions and therefore the intentions behind them. The frontal cortex also helps people relate to and understand each other, and you can imagine what happens when concern is misjudged as anger or worry as disappointment. The Fresh Prince has an entire song about it. But the truth is, as much as parents just don't understand, teens don't always understand either. When the emotional amygdala and the more rational cortex aren't fully hooked up yet, that can make it hard for teenagers to productively work through emotions. This kind of reactionary, impulsive behavior may also lead to more risk-taking. Adolescence is the time when we're most likely to experiment with whatever booze, drugs, or toad-licking is available, and unfortunately, it's also the time our developing brains are most vulnerable to lasting effects. Studies have shown that teens are more likely to become addicted to drugs and alcohol than adults, partly because their brains are more attuned to their reward centers. While the teenage prefrontal cortex is still developing, their nucleus accumbens, or pleasure and reward zone, forms early on. Neuroimaging studies have shown that when presented with a big potential reward, teen brains light up way more than kids' or adults' brains. But if the reward was small, teen brains hardly fired at all. So basically, give an adolescent a pat on the back and you'll get a shrug. Give them a hot date or a winning goal and their brains light up like Vegas. This, of course, does not always result in great judgment. A jacked up, thrill-seeking impulse combined with an exquisite pang of peer pressure, plus a new driver's license, new sex parts, and access to substances can lead to some not good results. But still, this long and sometimes tedious remodeling process that our bodies go through in the teenage years isn't all bad. Many scientists have pointed out that our delayed adolescence lets our brains keep their flexibility longer, which, yeah, may make teens a little slow, but also more adaptable as they prepare for the adult world. In this way, you can see teen impulsiveness as boldness or independent thinking, and moodiness as a source of newfound empathy, and excitability as passion. Which means there's a lot of awesome energy floating around out there ready to decrease all kinds of world suck. Thanks for watching this SciShow Infusion, and thanks especially to all of our subscribers on Subbable who make this channel possible. You can be an honorary associate producer of SciShow or even pick the topic of a future episode. To find out how,
Okay, so if you look in the guide on page 42, the advice that we have for you is, and some of you may be going, that's a lot, and it is, but it is intended to use that with teenagers, because here's what we're encouraging you to do is to have more intentional conversations with them about how their brains develop. And so if you'll see on page 42, we have a little idea for a chart there. This is kind of a standard teaching tool called a Kwl chart. you might start out a conversation with a teenager or a small group of teens about what do you know about how your brains develop? What do you know about the stage of development that your body is going through right now? And then you can have them write questions about what would you want to know? What questions would you have about development at 14, 15, 16? Then you can show this video, and then they can list in that third column what they've learned. And that can be a really engaging process. And you have to remember that a lot of kids do not have adults in their lives that they can have these kind of direct conversations with. Not many kids, I mean, I wish when I was a teenager that I had an adult that would have talked to me about how my brain is developing and how that works, that I may be quick to misreading adult reactions and facial expressions. So having these kinds of intentional conversations, while they can seem a little scary to us as adults, they can be super beneficial to kids in this age group. Amanda, you have any thoughts on that?
I don't think so. I love that video though, because it does explain a lot.
Mm-hmm. I have a new book coming out this fall, and it's a neuroscience book for counselors who work with children and adolescents. And one of the activities that we include in this new book is you can sit with a teen and a parent, or you can do this in your role that you're working with teens, have them go on like the internet or Instagram or Snapchat and sort of find freeze frame pictures of people with expressions on their face. And then you sit there and have them, you say, well, that person, what does it look like that person is experiencing? And they might say, well, they look really angry. And you can sit there and say, you know, that person to me looks like they're excited. And so tapping into something that comes off of this video, you can do this little activity, and it really helps them understand that maybe sometimes you're misreading the teacher's facial expression. Maybe sometimes you're misreading your stepmom's facial expression. But all of that can sort of grow out of having them watch this video, and then it can lead you into these really important discussions with them about how they're developing. Does that make sense? Is that helpful? I see a couple heads shaking. Okay. All right, so with that, Emily, let's go back to page 35. Sorry for the jumping around there, Emily. Let's talk about HALT, H-A-L-T. Jill, you're right. Facial expressions lost behind the masks. Good point. Excellent point. Let's talk about H-A-L-T, HALT. Again, this goes back to helping this age group increase their mindfulness. And it's also just a good strategy for you to be aware of for yourself and for the kids that you work with. You cannot be at the top of your game and manage your emotions if you are hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. And kids do not understand this. I didn't understand it when I was in this age group. I just thought that there were days where I got irritable, and you know, some days it was fine and some days it was bad. I did not learn and become self-aware until in my 20s that being hangry is a thing, right? You are irritable. Most people are become irritable, become generally off balance when they're hungry. If students are generally angry over life events or a divorce in their household or a family dysregulation or substance abuse or a parent being incarcerated, if they are lonely because they spend a lot of time at home alone without a parent, without a sibling, they've experienced isolation from peers during COVID, or if they are tired, if they are generally just exhausted, maybe they were up late because the police were called to their home over a domestic incident, or maybe they are doing school full time and working a part-time job after school. They're just tired. When you are tired, you are not at the top of your game. It is hard to manage your emotions. This is true for us, and it's true for them. So I have two pieces of advice. The first is just generally for working with this age group. If you can help teenagers solve some of their basic needs, that will help them regulate better. I am a huge proponent of teachers and counselors and people in any space working with kids to always have healthy, appropriate snacks on hand. If they're coming to you in an after school program, chances are they've not eaten since maybe 10:30, 11 a.m. Find a way to feed them. If you want a better result, find a way to feed them. If they're angry, we're going to go over a couple strategies to help that might help with the anger and the loneliness. And if they're tired, they may need that grace, right? To be able to go sit in the corner and chill out and close their eyes for 5 minutes. Now, here's what I say to teachers. You can't broadly, as a teacher or in a lot of these spaces, you can't say, come in here and sleep every day. But here's the thing. Some kids need rest, especially if they've had a traumatic event in their household the night before. So is there a way that we can give kids that grace where they need to just go rest for 5 minutes or get sleep for 5 minutes? Here's all I will say. If you try to make them push through their emotions when they're tired, it likely backfires on you. So just know what you're asking them to do. It's like any of you who have been or are in a love relationship, and maybe you've experienced this, it's never a good idea to have a financial conversation after about 8:30 or 9 o'clock at night, because one of you is tired and it usually is not going to go well. So it's the same for teenagers. If they are tired, there's more of a chance that you're going to poke a bear, right, than have someone who's going to cooperate and really be engaged in whatever activity you're asking them to engage in. So just for you as a person who works in a space with teenagers, asking yourself and your colleagues, are we seeing a lot of kids really grumpy in our program because they're hungry, they're angry, they're lonely, and they're tired? If the answer is yes, then let's work collaboratively to figure out how we solve some of these things for them. We've got to have a meal, we've got to have snacks, we've got to give them some time to chill out and rest. We're asking too much of them, they're exhausted. We've got to recognize the kids that have really tough home lives, that they just come every day really angry, right? So we're going to intervene in appropriate ways that maybe we can help offset some of those negative things. But here's the second thing I encourage you to do. And Emily, if you'll scroll down just a little bit, I would say intentionally teach this to the teenagers you work with. Teach them that when you're hungry, you are more likely to get in a fight. You are more likely to not do well on a test. You are more likely to make people around you not love you very much. Like, you're going to be more grumpy when you're hungry. You've got to monitor that. Try to figure out that you're hungry and try to get that need met. How can you appropriately get that need met? Teach kids about anger and loneliness and that they need their rest. Now, again, after you show them the brain video that we just watched, you can have a conversation about that. What did you think about that part of the video that said teenagers don't get enough rest? Is it hard for you to go to sleep before 11 o'clock at night? How do you manage that? It sounds like you're exhausted, but you can actually tie this conversation in and teach them this, right? If you're tired, where is a place you can go to relax? How many hours of sleep are you getting? Do you think that's enough? How can you manage to maybe get another hour? What do you do when you can't sleep? Is that a good strategy? Do you need other strategies when you can't fall asleep? How do you think you could get more sleep? So you can engage in intentional conversations about each of these and teach them that if you are hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, you are less likely and less able to control your emotions. Amanda, you want to join in on that? Any thoughts?
That sounded perfect to me. I just think this is a really good base to start with when you're talking with the kid and you're like, oh my goodness, how am I going to help them? Just kind of go through these and, like she was saying, teach them these, and that should get you rolling to see which one you need to work on with them.
Right. And if we go to page 37, Emily, I want to share this strategy with you all, this 2x10. This strategy particularly can help kids that are angry and lonely. And let me tell you about this one. There is no solid number research on this, but if you go online and you search this, there's a lot of what we call anecdotal research. That's people telling stories of how this technique has worked for them, okay? So let me teach you what a 2x10 is. A 2x10 is for that kiddo that you think is exceptionally angry or exceptionally lonely, what they need is human connection. And what they need is, all kids need connection, all kids need relationship. But especially these kids that you're finding are more challenging, you might try a 2 by 10. And here's what it is. You have one adult, the same adult, every day for 10 days. Pull that child aside, that teenager aside, and they sit with them for a minimum of 2 minutes. And what they do is they talk to that teenager about anything that teenager wants to talk about. It doesn't have to be about school. It doesn't have to be about the fact that they got suspended again. They can talk about chocolate chip cookies. They can talk about their four-wheeler. They can talk about going fishing. And I'm not the therapist in this relationship. I'm simply someone who is listening and making connection. But here's the key. You have to commit to it for the 10 days. So if you're not with the kids on weekends, that's fine, but it's got to be Monday through Friday and Monday through Friday. 10 times, 2 minutes a day, at least. Now, here's what I'm finding in my students that use it. And Amanda, I don't know if you've done a 2 by 10 with a student or not, but here's what I'm finding. This tends to regulate students in such a way that by the time you get to the 10th day, the adults that have been using it want to keep doing it, because it is working so well to help that student regulate their emotions, primarily their anger and their loneliness, that they want to keep doing it because they're seeing success with it. Now, you probably cannot do this with every kid you work with because you have too many. You're like teachers, you're like whatever. I see a lot of the rules that people have posted on here. The kids way outnumber the adults in your program, likely. This is what I'm saying, encouraging is you reserve this for the kid that you think really needs it because they are experiencing emotional stress, mostly related to anger and loneliness and a dysregulation in their home life. So you're pulling out, if you're thinking about like tiered interventions, these are the kids at the top of the triangle that need the most out of us to try to help regulate their emotions. If you go online and you Google 2 by 10, you'll probably get Home Depot or Lowe's or something. What you want to do is you want to Google 2 by 10 for educators. There are YouTube videos. There are lots of little blogs of teachers and principals and people that have trained their whole staffs on how to use this technique. I think it's worth putting in your toolbox for those kids that are struggling the most. Okay, and Amanda, let's go on to page 39, and why don't you tell us a little bit about self-care plans?
Okay, so I'm all about self-care for myself. So I love helping students with self-care. I actually used this with one of my elementary students. I kind of modified it a little bit, but we kind of just went through, we talked about when we need self-care the most, when we feel like we don't have time to do it, or we don't feel like doing it, or we don't want to do it. So Emily, can you scroll down a little bit, please? Thanks. A little bit more. There we go. Okay, thanks. So I actually printed this out, and I kind of just went through the differences between these categories, and we actually filled this out. So again, I had her come up with different things that she likes to do and different things that help her feel better. And just maybe a different way to ask that is what she likes to do in her free time or what she likes to do with her friends. So we kind of went through and wrote them down. And like I said, I like them to read them out loud. So I know not only they wrote them down, but that they understand them. And if they have questions about how they could do them, then we could go through that. And like I said, I always give them something to take with them. So I'm like, this is your self-care plan. And we talk about where they're going to put it so they see it every day, or where they're going to put it so that they know, like, when they need it the most, that they can read it if they forget. And I also have them pick 2 of their favorite. I seem to find that helpful to have them pick just 2, because sometimes we come up with a lot or more than 2. So have them focus on 2 at least until they come back and see you again the next day or week or whenever. And I have them practice those 2 and let me know if that helps.
That's fantastic, Amanda. And again, I love the emphasis there on something concrete that they take away. And I just want to pick up on something you said, realistic expectations. It is not realistic that they're going to go away from the work with you and do all of this, right?
Right.
So pick the 1 or 2, or maybe the 3, but probably not more than 3 that you really want to try to implement.
Mm-hmm.
And then Amanda, I'm going to feed into something because you're going to talk about, and Emily, we're going to shoot over now to page 43. I'm curious, Amanda, if sometimes that self-care plan doesn't include a piece of technology as part of the plan.
Yes, sometimes. So right now I'm currently working with elementary students, but I try to at least use even the ones that are for 6 through 8 and 9 through 12. I try to kind of change those up a little bit to work with my students. But yeah, so when we're talking about self-care, sometimes that is just getting on their iPads, because all of our students have iPads. They'll get on there and play different games. And one of my students that I've been working with, she really likes to use this app. I can't remember what it's called, but she just gets on and draws. So we put that as part of her self-care plan as well.
So the really neat thing about working with this age group is, and we're seeing younger and younger kids have cell phones. And so I don't want to promote that kids should increase their screen time, because I have concerns over kids spending too much time on their screens. But if they're going to be on their screens, I like the idea of the older kids using some of the apps that we list on page 44 as really helping them increase mindfulness, calm, using things like the Calm app, or My Life, which is meditation and mindfulness, or unique daily affirmations, or motivation daily quotes. And look, we list 4 here, but the list could have been endless. These are just, I think, 2 that Amanda really likes and 2 that I really like. But asking teenagers, go on the internet and do a little research and find an app that seems appealing to you for mindfulness, meditation, yoga, daily affirmations, quotes that will inspire you every day. So the really neat thing about working with this particular age group is that they can engage in that kind of work, and most of them would love it, right? If you're saying get on your phone, because most of the adults in their lives are not telling them to get on their phone. And finding an app that's free that will help them really be actively pursuing that self-care through meditation and mindfulness. We keep talking about mindfulness, and I just want to say something about mindfulness. For your students and for your kiddos that you're working with, a lot of them have experienced trauma. One of the ways that we helped kids mitigate their risk from the trauma they've experienced is we help them build these things called protective factors. And one protective factor that we like to help kids develop is mindfulness and self-regulation. If a young person can develop mindfulness practices, become more mindful, and learn how to self-regulate, research shows that helps them overcome the negative effects of having experienced a traumatic event. That's why we keep saying these things about mindfulness. That's why you keep hearing yoga is a mindfulness practice. Meditation is a mindfulness practice. Breathing is a practice connected to mindfulness. So that is one of the things that we can teach kids that will help increase the chances that they don't lack resilience needed in life. And a lot of kids who have experienced trauma do not have very strong resiliency skills. Another protective factor that has been shown to decrease the risk of negative effects of trauma is having one caring adult in that child's life that provides structure and limits. A lot of people think that has to be a parent. It does not have to be a parent. It can be you as the leader of the Boys and Girls Club, as the mentor in the AmeriCorps project, as the teacher in the classroom, as the teacher's assistant in the classroom. Ideally, we would love for it to be a parent, but we all know on this call that oftentimes that cannot be a parent for a lot of different reasons. But we know by research that if teenagers have that one nurturing, caring adult who provides structure and boundaries, that can help mitigate the risks of trauma. So that's why you see a lot of these activities are based around mindfulness and connection, right? Mindfulness and connection who can connect with this kid, who can teach them to be more mindful. Okay, Emily, you can stop sharing. So I hope that this time is helpful, and reviewing some of these activities has been a good use of your time. I'd like to open it up, if we can, for questions or comments. Anybody have any thoughts or any questions about any of the activities that we've outlined here this afternoon? I see in the chat, Beth comments that they hear a lot of stories from Girl Scout leaders that the leaders are serving as that one caring adult, and that changes girls' lives. I agree. I absolutely agree. And I'm glad that people are still using Girl Scouts in that way. I'm glad that girls are still joining Girl Scouts, because so many girls need that.
So I just unmuted also, and I don't know if anybody was paying attention to the school superintendent last summer, but he spent a lot of time talking about one caring adult and how important that is. So I know that that's a huge thing all across West Virginia. And I took a ton of notes and put sticky notes all through my book, because I think this feels very approachable, and the way you talked us through it made it really, just seem like it's something we would easily be able to replicate.
Thanks for saying that, Beth. I absolutely agree with that. And you prompted me I want to say this to all of you. And I hope what I'm about to say is taken in the spirit that I'm really giving it. You all are on the front lines with these kids, and a lot of you are not trained to be counselors and therapists. You don't have to be, you shouldn't be, okay? I think by virtue of all of us on this call, we're mandated reporters, right? So if a child, a teen, or an adolescent says something and we suspect that something is wrong in their universe, it's our job to report it, not to investigate it, but to report it, okay? But let me say this, you're not a counselor, you're not a therapist, that's okay. I don't think you can hurt them by trying these things. These are not like, we're not asking you to be untrained professionals doing hypnosis or, right? Or these are simple strategies that if you mess up, if you make a mistake, you're not going to hurt them, right? It's better for you to say, I think I messed that up. I made a mistake. Let me reword that, or let's think through that again. What would be a better idea for you for self-care? You're in there trying to help. And you're in there trying to help them. We need more people helping kids deal with their social and emotional and their mental health issues. So Beth, I appreciate what you're saying. We wanted to do these workshops, I think, Emily, because we wanted the opportunity to just give you a little more insight on how to use these, but they're meant to be simple, and they're meant to be something you can use to engage. And you really can't make a mistake that's going to mess a child up.
I think our students just need to know that we are there for them and willing to listen to them.
I agree. Thanks, Esther. Yeah. And hopefully you can implement some of these little activities, even in whole classrooms, that the kids will really enjoy and really benefit from, to increase their social and emotional learning.
I know I showed my assistant principal the grades 9 through 12, and she looked at it, and I seen where you said we'd get a copy of this, and she's hoping that at the beginning of next year I can talk about it, or at least show them a couple of the videos, and maybe help all of our teachers here at the school.
Fantastic. Reach out if we can help, Esther, in any way.
I will. Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else? Comments or questions? We're here to support you, and we just want you to feel confident about using any of the strategies you feel inclined to use. Well, I appreciate all of you. I always say this, and Amanda, I'll say a couple things, and then you can say a couple things. Probably of any of us on the call, my job is the easiest. I get to work with great students like Amanda, great colleagues like Emily. I try to see a client, I keep a client load of 3 to 4 kiddos because I like to keep my skills sharp and they keep me young and they keep me on my toes. But I am very well aware that everybody on this call, including Amanda, you're the front lines. You're seeing kids struggle every day from 7:30 in the morning until 3:30 in the evening, or Vicky, you get them at 3:30 and you have them until 7 or 8, or, you know, like you're really the frontline people, and your jobs are hard because you're out there supporting these students in all these different ways. So thank you for the work that you do. If this toolkit, if one activity in this toolkit helps you help a kid, it will have been well worth the work and the effort that Amanda and Emily and everybody at the Palatine Foundation and everybody at Education Alliance and AmeriCorps really put into this. So just keep doing what you're doing. Don't get discouraged. My favorite line, one of my all-time favorite Broadway play is Hamilton. If you haven't seen Hamilton on Disney Plus, I encourage you to get with a friend and watch that. But Hamilton, in the last scene of the play, where I think it's not a spoiler alert. I mean, I think people know Hamilton passes away in the end, but he says, you know, what is a legacy? It's planting seeds in a garden that you never get to see. And a lot of times working with kids feels that way, right? You never get to see the results of the labor, but you're planting seeds. And if this toolkit helps you plant a seed or two, you've done a good job. So don't get frustrated. Keep up the good work. We appreciate you. Keep doing this good work. Amanda, any final thoughts?
I just want to say thank you all again for hopping on here. And also, I just wish that I had someone like you all that cares about kids so much to teach me at least one of these tools out of the toolkit. So thank you all for taking the time out of your day.
Emily, we're all finished.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chris and Amanda. That was a wonderful session. And thank you, each of you, for joining us today. We hope today's session was helpful and we would like to receive your feedback. Please take a minute to complete the brief survey that I put in the chat before you leave today. Again, to download a copy of the toolkit, you can go to our website at educationalliance.org/SEL. We want to extend a big thank you to Chris and Amanda for all of their work on this toolkit, and also to the Palatine Foundation for making today's training possible. So this will conclude our session, and we really appreciate you joining.